Welcome to the Just Solutions podcast, where we explore relevant projects, policies, and stories from the perspective of the communities most impacted by climate change: Black, Indigenous, people of color, and those with lower incomes. I'm your host, Aiko Schaefer, Executive Director of Just Solutions. I'm joined today by Arjun Makhijani, President of the Institute for Energy and Environmental Research. He is a recognized authority on energy and an author of numerous reports and books on energy and environment-related issues. His book on hydrogen energy, titled Hydrogen, What Good Is It?, will be published in the coming weeks. He's been a longtime partner of Just Solutions and a frequent guest on our podcast, recently working with us as a technical expert, partnering with environmental justice organizations on a newly released EJ framework titled Hydrogen Energy, a Critical Review to Ensure Community and Climate Benefits. Welcome back, Arjun, to the Just Solutions podcast.
Well, thank you very much, Aiko, for having me. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Today, we're exploring hydrogen energy and its connection to environmental justice. As a part of the federal infrastructure package, we are spending $7 billion to fund hydrogen hubs. Additionally, we are funding $100 billion for a hydrogen production tax credit and updated greenhouse gas standards for fossil fuel power plants. This is part of an overall federal agenda to increase hydrogen production 5 times by 2050. Today, we're analyzing the hydrogen energy technology and if it fits into climate justice goals. So, to help us get started, can you just cover the basics of hydrogen technology? How does it work?
Well, hydrogen is an energy source, or can be an energy source, because like fuels, you oxidize it and it releases energy. You can generate electricity with it in a special device called a fuel cell. You can burn it just like you burn natural gas or oil, and it releases heat. You can make steam, generate electricity. You can use it in industry. So hydrogen can be used as an energy source. The one big difference is that unlike, say, oil or natural gas or uranium, hydrogen is made from some other energy source. So far, it's not available naturally, like you drill a hole and you find hydrogen. They're trying, but we make hydrogen mainly from natural gas. So that's the one big difference, technically.
In terms of hydrogen as a climate solution, it seems like that we're only looking at it from the burning of hydrogen, so it looks clean, which is different than the overall climate impact of generating hydrogen as a fuel to burn. Reading your research, it seems important that you make this distinction.
Yeah. If you're going to propose a climate solution, you have to look at from the beginning, where does the hydrogen come from, how are you going to use it, and what are the impacts. So first of all, we're doing this because of climate. That hydrogen, when you burn it or combine it with oxygen chemically in a fuel cell, it does not release CO2 or any other greenhouse gases. But that does not mean that hydrogen doesn't have a climate impact if it leaks. It does. About 1% of our current climate impact from everything is actually due to hydrogen that we already use, like to make fertilizer and to make refined products in oil refineries. So we have to consider the indirect climate impact, and you have to consider it from beginning to end, starting with the fact that we currently make hydrogen from natural gas, and it's very carbon intensive.
So given that more holistic approach to thinking about hydrogen energy, do you think this is the technology that can save the planet?
There's no the technology that can save the planet. You can say generally electrification of most things, but then the electricity has to come from somewhere. So yeah, thinking of what they call technical silver bullets is not quite a fool's errand. You should look for suitable technology. So it's not a fool's errand, but we have to think differently. It's the same with atom bombs. Our two big problems, climate and atom bombs. We should follow Einstein's advice. He said, we have to learn to think differently. And on atom bombs and on climate, we haven't yet learned that. And so the starting question, Aiko, is why don't we use hydrogen as an energy source? When you burn it, it doesn't produce CO2. It does produce nitrogen oxide pollution. But when you combine it with oxygen and fuel cells, it only produces water. So why aren't we using it? It looks so friendly to climate, right? We aren't using it because you have to make it from some other fuel. And if you make it from some other fuel, by the time you get to the tailpipe of your hydrogen bus, or the stack of your power plant, you've lost 50% of your energy or more. And so basically, it's just cheaper to burn the natural gas than to use the hydrogen. We're talking about it today because when you use it, it doesn't have CO2. But if you start from the beginning, you realize you have to make the hydrogen in ways that doesn't emit CO2 or greenhouse gases and limit the leaks. So there's a lot of constraints. And hydrogen properly used can help solve some very difficult problems in the world. Steel production. We make ammonia. Ammonia comes from natural gas. Making ammonia with green hydrogen from renewable energy. So it can help some very critical problems in the world. But A, it's not a silver bullet. And B, if you don't think holistically from beginning to end, and that's before we get to the whole problem of environmental justice and what's it going to do to overburden communities and all that.
And when you think about the problems with hydrogen energy, are those things that can be solved, or are those things inherent to that source of energy?
Well, they can be solved, but it's a lot more complicated than industry and government would lead you to believe. So, for example, take hydrogen made with solar energy or hydrogen made with nuclear energy. They are, close to zero carbon energy sources. But if you divert existing nuclear energy or existing solar energy that's being used for something like heating your house or running your neighborhood factory, that electricity must come from somewhere. And it's going to come from the existing infrastructure, which is hydropower, natural gas, coal-fired, nuclear. That mix, when you do that global calculation, and we did this in our book, Tom Herzbach and I, we found that the hydrogen plant that the Department of Energy is subsidizing or supporting, a pilot plant at the 9 Mile Point in New York State, 9 Mile nuclear plant in New York State, the carbon emissions from that globally, taking into account what's going to happen to the loads that nuclear is currently supplying, are more than the worst method of hydrogen production in terms of climate. So you have to have what's called additionality. You can make low or zero carbon hydrogen, but you have to make it either with new sources of zero carbon energy, electricity, or you make it from solar and wind energy that you would otherwise curtail. So, for instance, in Texas, they throw away a lot of wind energy because there's a surplus supply sometimes, and it's easier to cut off wind than to cut off a coal plant or a gas plant or a nuclear plant. So they throw away a lot. You could make 100,000 tons of hydrogen from wind energy that's thrown away. Now, that would be truly green hydrogen with pretty close to zero emissions. So you have to do it very carefully, and you have to do the numbers honestly. And that's the starting point. And then you have to keep the leaks low. By low, I mean globally less than about 5%.
And do you think that in the current conversation we're having about hydrogen energy, that people are thinking about these very different sources of energy? Do you foresee us being able to make those better choices versus the choices that are not good?
Given the power of the fossil fuel industry, the current direction looks only partly okay, I would say, not necessarily great even or good even partly, because there are a lot of proposals for what's called blue hydrogen. Hydrogen's been given a palette of colors. Blue hydrogen is hydrogen we currently make from natural gas and just emit the CO2 to the atmosphere. That's called gray hydrogen. And blue hydrogen is you propose to capture the CO2, compress it, put it in a pipeline, and stick it deep underground or under the ocean somewhere. So that's carbon sequestration. The government's assumptions for how well we can do this are wildly optimistic, 96%, whereas in practice is 30 to 80%. And that doesn't take into account that you need more natural gas to make hydrogen that way, because you have to capture the hydrogen and you have more air pollution, you have to pump the carbon dioxide. So when you do the global calculation, including methane leaks and natural gas leaks and their greenhouse gas impact, by our calculation, blue hydrogen will not make what the DOE has itself said is a clean hydrogen standard. And that's much more lax than what the EPA says a clean hydrogen standard should be. So taking the more lax government approach, it won't make the cut. And so we shouldn't be thinking about blue hydrogen till we eliminate methane leaks at least, and that's going to be a long time, at least a decade, probably a lot more. So for now, I would say think green hydrogen, think additionality, that is new sources of zero carbon energy, and forget about blue hydrogen. So that's sort of a formula for the starting point of how we should think about hydrogen. And then where we should use it is a separate question.
And Arjun, before we get into the environmental justice implications and just digging a little deeper on the technology itself, it's not the silver bullet. And we know it'll take a myriad of solutions. But when you think about a plan to save the planet, starting today, in the list of things that we should be doing, where does hydrogen fit in? Where would you put it on that list?
Well, I would say in terms of supply, and the most important thing in energy is to think about efficiency. That should be the starting point for everything, because it means you need less renewable energy, and so less of the costly stuff, more affordable. And given that, hydrogen, I would say, I would put it at level 3. So the top level of supply is solar and wind energy. They're plentiful. They're zero carbon in principle. And you need to couple them with storage systems. And, there's a whole bunch of stuff that goes with it. But that's sort of the top level. The second level, I would say, is thermal storage and thermal technologies. So what do you do with all the surplus wind and solar that you generate in the spring and fall that you don't really need? Instead of throwing it away, what do you do with it? And I think thermal storage, especially high temperature thermal storage that can be used in industry, lower temperature storage that can be used for home heating, geothermal heating systems, that I would say is extremely important, and we're not attending to it with the priority it deserves. We're pouring billions into hydrogen, and I haven't heard that we're pouring billions into thermal storage the way we should. And I would say hydrogen is important for ammonia, for steel, potentially for cement, for high temperature heat. And in the longer term, by longer term, I mean sort of post 2035-ish, for peaking electricity generation. So when we can make lots of hydrogen from surplus renewable energy, we should make a fair amount of it, with some caveats that I'd like to come to. And we can use it in fuel cells for electricity generation. Lots of different ways have been proposed, but so far as, in my opinion, there's only one good way to use hydrogen for electricity generation, which is in fuel cells.
And I'd like, Arjun, that before you laid out where hydrogen falls in the myriad of solutions, to recognize the important role of efficiency and, of course, conservation, right? So recognizing that we can't continue to live the lives we're living, especially for those with, on the higher end, economic end of the scale, who are big energy users. And so really needing to get at those fundamentals that you and I've talked about so often. So, we are throwing a lot of money at hydrogen as taxpayers. And it seems to me there are a lot of caveats to how well it can work. There's a lot of uncertainty about how the technology will work. But it's a significant investment, and I think something that we're really hoping that it will accomplish that. So we've done a show with you on nuclear energy. We've done a show on sequestration and carbon capture. I mean, how is hydrogen energy similar or dissimilar to those other investments and technologies?
Well, let me say the good thing first. So carbon capture from coal-fired power plants, natural gas power plants, new nuclear power plants should be non-starters in any sort of rational, climate-centered, urgency-oriented calculation for what should we do to get to a decarbonized electricity system by 2035 and zero by 2045, zero for the whole energy system. They should be non-starters. I mean, the numbers are screaming that, but the lobbies are very powerful. And hydrogen is different in the sense that it if you make green hydrogen, it has a very important short-term application like displacing natural gas for ammonia production and displacing coking coal for steel production. And its applications in the longer term can be bigger because you can make hydrogen more easily from surplus renewable energy. So it's different in that sense, but we have to recognize that in the shorter term, the applications are pretty limited if you do a rigorous calculation. That is, even if you have renewable energy, should you be making hydrogen with it, or should you be, say, electrifying natural gas heated homes? We did a calculation about that in the book, and what we call the opportunity cost. If you're really serious about climate, you have to decide what you want to do first, what's cheapest, what's best, what's fastest. By that calculation, the shorter term uses of hydrogen are pretty limited. They're pretty big in the absolute BTU sense, but they're limited as a fraction of the energy that we use. And we should keep that in mind. And especially, we need to figure out the water consumption. So hydrogen takes a lot of water. Green hydrogen, you make it from water, split H2O into H2 and O2. So, there are the Southwest, the Colorado River Basin. There are a lot of water-stressed regions. Even regions that are not water-stressed, like the Southeast, can have shortages and droughts from time to time. So, citing hydrogen production, like should you do it in Texas, for example, given what is going on, is going to be a pretty complicated thing, and where the water is going to come from. Be good to develop some new technologies. Can we make it from seawater, for example, which we can't today?
Interesting. And so help us understand, though, given what we know about the implications for water, why are they being cited in Texas?
Well, they haven't been yet cited in Texas.
Exactly. Assuming that will happen, yes.
So the hydrogen hubs, the way they were selected, I don't know whether not having the New Mexico sort of Southwest-centered hub, there's no New Mexico sort of Arizona-centered hub, may have had an eye to water. I hope it did. Water hasn't shown up as an explicit major criterion in the government's thinking, for instance, in the tax credits that the Treasury is preparing. But I think it should be a major consideration. Even just if you want a reliable hydrogen supply, and not a lot of fights and lawsuits that could stop, if you want to do it right from a pro-hydrogen industry point of view, you should be careful where you cite it.
Arjun, I think that part of the thing that seems to make all this analysis a little challenging is the lack of transparency around these different technologies. So to what extent do we really know how the currently selected hydrogen hubs will actually work?
We know very little because a lot of there are these coalitions of corporations and governments basically that have made these applications, utilities, government labs, whatever. And we haven't seen, how did the government score these various proposals? There were dozens of proposals and 7 were selected. So why were so many proposals that would make blue hydrogen selected, even though the numbers indicating that blue hydrogen, not such a good idea, at least not for the foreseeable future? By foreseeable future, I mean 10, 12 years. So we need to see that. We haven't seen the full proposals made by these consortia, that are in the hydrogen hubs. And then there will be hydrogen projects that are not part of the hubs. The Treasury draft proposals on how the tax credits are going to be granted, they've been published, of course, but they are quite fuzzy on how they're going to deal with blue hydrogen, for example. We don't know exactly how that money is going to be allocated. And it's going to be, other than the cash money that the government is proposing to give, the tax credits are obviously going to be, a lot of the bargain for those who are proposing to build hydrogen plants and use hydrogen. So the using end is a whole nother thing that we need to talk about, because that is also an issue. You think if you have the hydrogen, there should be no problem, but that is not the case. There's a reason hydrogen is out there. We know how to produce it. The US produces 10 million tons. The world produces 90 million tons. That's a lot of hydrogen. Why isn't anybody, it has only a tiny use as an energy source. The reason nobody's using it as an energy source is that it's costly. So you can make the hydrogen, but will there be the demand? We live in a sort of market-oriented society, and if nobody buys the hydrogen, it's not going to be very good for your business. The government, on the other hand, is also kind of worrying about how can we stimulate the demand for hydrogen. So, so, so is it going to stimulate the demand for hydrogen in the right places? And there's also R&D, in fairness, a good R&D that is directed at how can we make green hydrogen cheaper. So green hydrogen costs about $5 a kilogram, $5 equivalent to a gallon of gasoline, roughly speaking. It needs to be closer to $1 or $2, so cost needs to come down by 2, 3, 4 times, 5 times even, in order for people to say, yeah, I can use this and make money in my business. That's a pretty big issue. And so government subsidies are also going to go there. Then ratepayer subsidies, so the natural gas companies that supply homes and businesses with natural gas are proposing to buy hydrogen and put it in natural gas pipelines. And, those costs would be covered by ratepayers because it's just passed on to the ratepayers. And natural gas companies want to keep their pipelines going. It's a terrible proposal, let me say. The analysis is there in our book, Hydrogen, What Good Is It? And the reason it's posed as a question is there is some good in it, but lots of caveats.
And Arjun, can you talk a little bit about the growth in hydrogen and its implications on the overall kind of energy systems?
Yeah, so hydrogen in that sense today is like electricity. We don't capture natural electricity from lightning to run our refrigerators. We don't know how to do that yet. Ben Franklin tried, but so we make electricity from coal, nuclear energy, solar energy, wind energy, and that's a primary energy source, and we turn it into electricity carried in the wires. The difference between electricity and hydrogen, on the positive side for hydrogen, is that you can store hydrogen more easily than you can store electricity. Electricity you can store in batteries and so on, but it's pretty costly, it's pretty resource intensive. On the plus side for electricity, storing electricity and getting it back from a battery is a lot more efficient than storing electricity in the form of hydrogen and then getting back as electricity. That round-trip efficiency is 40-50%. Round-trip efficiency for batteries is 85%. In a less nerdy way of saying things is you'll need a lot more solar panel and wind turbines to do the same thing with hydrogen, making hydrogen and making electricity, than you will making electricity and then putting in a battery and then getting it back. So it's much more efficient. Less solar panels, millions and millions less solar panels. And that, of course, means you're using less resources, you're using less copper, you're using less silver, less mining, less environmental impact. Solar energy is renewable, but doesn't mean that it doesn't have impacts. Everything has impacts when you have some mining involved.
Yeah. Well, it's a difficult argument to make given around hydrogen energy. We're investing as taxpayers $7 billion in this technology. Technology, again, you point out that we're not entirely sure what that technology is. In addition to that are the tax credits on hydrogen energy. So just extraordinary investment as a country, as people into the technology. And Arjun, I think, helping us understand that. And I think pointing out that, perhaps this is not the best place to put our money. And I think it helps us think, too, then about the EJ implications. And the EJ community has been very clear that this is a false solution, the implications of how it will continue to prop up and continue to facilitate the fossil fuel industry. So help us understand this question around the EJ implications for technology or for this technology.
So I wouldn't call hydrogen a false solution in the same category, as the others, because there are some very important problems that hydrogen can solve, even in the short term. As I said, ammonia is central to the agricultural system as we have it. 30 years from now, we may want a different system without ammonia, but for now, we won't have food in the grocery stores without ammonia. So if you use green hydrogen to make ammonia, it would have a material impact, in reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So it's different in that way. But there are very important environmental justice implications. The most important and immediate is the water use. how much water is going to be used. There are immediate EJ implications of hydrogen in the sense of where do you put it, safety questions. Are you putting it in areas, like Cancer Alley in Texas and Louisiana, where there's already a lot of toxic burdens? Are you imposing more safety issues from hydrogen pipelines and so on? Especially if there's carbon capture and storage, more natural gas, more fracking. There are the immediate safety issues. There are also global environmental justice issues, and then there's environmental justice issues associated with water. Whose water are you taking? Are you violating indigenous rights? And that's very, very important. There are global issues because, for instance, you need iridium and platinum and nickel in hydrogen production technologies and hydrogen use also. These come from the global south very often, places like South Africa and Indonesia, and within the global north, US, Australia, Canada, and so on. They are often produced on indigenous lands. So mining rare materials generally has huge impacts. For instance, the mine tailings, the waste materials, often contain toxic metals, heavy metals, radioactive materials like uranium and thorium and so on. So hydrogen production and use has, like other things, environmental justice impact. So you have to attend to where you're citing these things, but you should also calculate a global impact. So if you're using hydrogen to displace natural gas, and ammonia production is sort of my exhibit A, or using hydrogen to displace coking coal in steel, that's my exhibit A in industry for coal. You're going to produce some environmental benefits. Coking coal requires a lot of coal. It's very dangerous to produce, creates lots of toxicity for workers. Natural gas, of course, fracking produces a lot of water pollution and, seismic issues besides the methane leaks and climate impacts. So there are positive implications globally if you produce hydrogen right and use it right to displace natural gas. But if you do it wrong, you could make existing environmental justice issues worse. The short of it is, the global issues are unavoidable if you're going to use it. So we should have some rigorous rules for the supply chain. Where is it procured? How are the workers treated? Is the environment being protected? We can't just do like we do with, the metals that go into our smartphones and say, okay, over there, we'll see about that later. And it doesn't matter what's happening in the Congo.
And again, your point about really changing the way we think about how we're selecting and creating climate solutions. And so, Arjun, on the point of hydrogen, you point out that there are ways in which this technology could be okay from a climate environmental justice perspective, but it seems that is a very narrow sort of portion of investment that we are making in hydrogen energy, that still the vast majority are from technologies, existing fossil fuel sources, nuclear energy, things that we have talked about on the show being fundamentally at odds with environmental justice. So how is hydrogen energy going to reinforce the existing fossil fuel industry? Help us understand the functioning of how those two things live together.
Let me give you some don'ts. Don't use hydrogen in light-duty vehicles. Electricity, battery vehicles, much better. Don't mix hydrogen with natural gas in pipelines. Lots of pollution issues, lots of leakage issues, lots of cost issues, and little to no to negative climate benefit. That is, it could be worse for climate even. The do's, I would say, make green hydrogen from curtailable renewable energy. If you locate it in water scarce areas, maybe treat your sewage water and, purify that water and use that for making hydrogen and maybe make distributed hydrogen. Something we didn't actually cover in detail in our book, but I think it's a gap that we should fill in the future. And then use it in places like making ammonia, making methanol, making steel, develop the cement applications. In the longer term, the uses of hydrogen can expand because we can make it more cleanly with less opportunity cost than today. But in the short term, I think the amount of money proposed for hydrogen is out of proportion to its short-term benefit compared to things like efficiency, compared to things like energy justice, phasing out natural gas from low-income households, compared to distributed thermal storage and geothermal networks for heating. There are lots of technologies that should be higher priority. And of course, CCS and nuclear energy funding is even worse than hydrogen funding, but we've already covered that.
So we just completed a project bringing together environmental justice organizations in communities where hydrogen energy is likely to be sited, brought them together with you and Tom Hirschbach from the Woods Institute for the Environment at Stanford University. How did working intensely and intentionally with impacted communities shape your newly published book, Hydrogen? What good is it?
Well, I've generally, that's been the orientation of my professional life. So it was, as I have always found, very rewarding. For instance, I hadn't done the numbers on hydrogen and water. It's the most important example. And people said, well, you should do the numbers on hydrogen and water. And so I did. And I was shocked by how important and what a large use of water hydrogen production would be, independent of the method of production. Whether you produce blue hydrogen or green hydrogen, about the same. And if you produce it with nuclear energy, it would be the worst. And so you use more than double the water of the other methods because of the water needs for nuclear electricity production. And the sharp questions, I remember there were questions about, toxic chemicals in aircraft fuels, if it's made from hydrogen, that I had not thought of, and neither Tom, and we had to go to an aircraft fuels expert to, figure that out. And so I have found that the people who are experiencing the problem of environmental injustice usually are not only suffering the most, but about many things they are the most knowledgeable of all, because they're right there, they're activists, they're community leaders, they got there by a certain path. And so I've always found working with them very rewarding technically, other than personally. So, I honor Just Solutions for having put this great research collaborative together. And I continue to work with them, and I look forward to working with them as we develop these hydrogen hubs.
Thank you for that, Arjun.
Thank you very much, Heiko.
Thank you, Arjun, for being with us today, and thanks to our listeners for joining us on the Just Solutions podcast. That's a wrap on Season 1. Stay tuned for Season 2, where we'll have more amazing guests on the show sharing their stories and expertise from the perspective of the communities most impacted by climate change. We'll have an upcoming show to dig into community-directed research, bringing in our environmental justice partners on this project to share their experiences and best practices, so please look for that next season. Special thanks to our producer, Taylor Ward, and our recording engineer and editor, Angel Batista. If you enjoyed this episode, leave us a review wherever you listen to podcasts. If you'd like to know more about our work at Just Solutions or to support this podcast and our work financially, visit our website at justsolutionscollective.org. You can also follow us on Instagram, LinkedIn, Twitter, and Facebook for the latest updates. Together, we are driving community-created and equity-centered solutions to the climate crisis. We hope you'll join us for the next episode.